Well, no sooner than I finished uploading that most recent episode of the Club Outside Q&A Roundup series, which you can find on the channel now, did Kubo drop an absolute banger of a lore reveal that I just had to cover as well here in a quick video, as it answers a question a lot of people have had for a while, myself included. Why was Lille Barro capable of surviving having his head cut off, and then going even further and transforming into some weird angelic dragon monster? It's a pretty straightforward question. Look, some of the Quincy Volston dish, they are pretty strange, and even downright unnatural, but Lige Zilliel always stuck out from the crowd as being, well, extreme. At the end of the day, the Quincy, for as odd as they were, for as seemingly inhumanly durable as they were still meant to be human at their core. Now, of course, there are some notable exceptions that are explicitly called out as such in the story. It made sense that the likes of Gerard and Pernida would be these unearthly, divine, unkillable beings because they were literally portions of the Soul King's power. Meanwhile, Askin was very clearly, although a member of the Schutzstaffel as well, very clearly just a guy, and he died as such. But Lige, there was never really a reason given for his immortality and his godly ability, outside of a pretty vague allusion to the fact. Today, though, Kubo has at last detailed why Lige was such a strange, unusual case among the Sternritter, and why it was ultimately fitting that he was the leader of the Schutzstaffel. So let's take a look. By the way, if you want to support weekly Bleach content like this, the best way to do so is by checking out my Patreon down in the description below. Over there you can help support the channel that extra step further, just like everyone appearing on screen is doing right now. A huge shout out and a massive thank you goes to those patron supporters. They are making a massive difference and it really does help out a lot. Now, it's important to remember that it wasn't specifically Lige Schrift, that's not easy to say, that gave everyone pause for thought, though the X-axis is absurdly powerful in its own right. The X-axis, of course, allows Lige to destroy anything on said axis generally by using his sniper rifle diagram, which doubles as his Quincy bow. The attack cannot be blocked, as Lige doesn't fire anything. Instead, he simply annihilates everything that exists between his target and the barrel of his gun. As I've said many times before, it works as a concrete rule, so far, so good, right? It seems simple enough. Things started to get a little questionable, however, once Lige opened up his second eye, revealing the true nature, or the quintessence, of his X-axis power. By opening his eye in a moment of crisis, when his life was threatened, he was able to phase through said attack. And once he'd been forced to open his eye 3 times in a single fight, he was then allowed to keep it open, thereby unleashing the X-axis's true strength. This is where Lige begins to talk of his power in relation to the sinners, and some kind of higher authority imposing rules upon his strength, as though it were divine in itself and not just another shrift. And, with both eyes open, Lige goes on to activate his Volston dish, and becomes completely intangible all the time. No attack can hurt him, with everything simply passing straight through his body, some of which now appears to be made out of light. So Kubo was already going pretty hard with the angelic theme for Lige, dialing up a motif that the Quincy had already encompassed, but even so, he still seemed to be, for the most part, just another Quincy, just another regular Sternritter, albeit perhaps the single most powerful one we had yet seen, so we're stretching the definition of regular pretty far here. And yet Kyoraku would go on to seemingly prove that, ultimately using his Bankai to circumvent Lige's the X-axis and kill the Sternritter, cutting off his head and destroying it in a violent explosion that then sent the Quincy plunging to the depths of Kyoraku's own abyssal power. Even the very weirdest of Sternritter that we'd seen up until that point, and we'd seen some weird ones, save for the aforementioned Pernida, because Pernida, as I said, was established as something entirely different. All of them would have been finished off by that attack, because again, they are ostensibly meant to just be human. And yet, Lige came back to life. This went way beyond anything the X-axis had demonstrated before, way beyond intangibility, way beyond existence erasure. Now, in terms of the wider Bleach narrative, we're talking about characters who can do something akin to the likes of Aizen. Bleach is full of broken, incredible powers, but actually resurrecting from death? That was still relatively rare in the grand scheme of things. Like I said, it was really only something that Aizen had been proven to be able to do. His headless body floats back up into the sky, and as he screams at Kyoraku, his head literally reforms from Reishi as he resurrects. But it went even further than that. Unlike basically every single other Sternritter, Lije suddenly demonstrated a second form, a second, almost evolved version of his holy form that took on a much more monstrous, abstract, draconic, almost avian appearance, with owl-like features set into the head of a cherubim, which itself rested on a gigantic serpentine neck. Lije, as it would turn out, was essentially completely unkillable, and now, where his body had been partially made of light before, he was now entirely made of light. There was no doubt about it, Kubo was doing something different with this guy, and going way beyond him simply being a normal human. But why? What reason was given for this seemingly divine power that had been bestowed upon him? Before we continue, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the channel recently. It is a huge, huge help in our journey to reach 300,000 subs by the end of the year. If you haven't yet done so yourself, maybe you're new, or maybe you just haven't hit that button yet, consider doing so today. It's very easy to do, it's quick, it's free, and it does help me out enormously, so thank you all so very much. So, what reasoning was given for this divine power? Well, we didn't really know. Lije himself drops a couple of extremely vague contextual clues, revealing that he was the first Quincy to receive a shrift from Yhwach. Supposedly, at least according to Lije himself, that made him Yhwach's masterpiece, and in his own eyes he was, and I quote, much more than a man on the outskirts of being a god, or in a different translation, just simply the one closest to God. That line, as it turns out, is much more important and telling than we maybe first thought. Not only that, but Lije noted that as a result of his position as the first to receive a shrift, he enjoyed special privileges from His Majesty, though that too was pretty vague. So with all that said and done, what's Kubo's newest answer that helps to reframe Lige's character and power? Well, it's extremely interesting, and it does recontextualize much of what we knew not just about Lije, but about the Shrift in general, and puts renewed spotlight on the Vandenrijk's timeline once again. A reader asked Kubo the following question: how come Lije was able to come back in a weird form despite being decapitated and dismembered? I like it, it's a good question, worth asking, and it was very straight to the point. And Kubo replied by saying, Lije is the oldest Quincy to receive Yhwach's power, and has never once lost it since then. For that reason, because the power inside of him had grown excessively, it had started to change his body into something more than human. Well, that is rather intriguing, and like I said, it seems to dredge up a litany of new questions that now also need answering. And of course, thanks to M Shadows over on fanverse.org for having the translation. So, what does Kubo's answer actually mean? Firstly, let's talk about Kubo's initial remark that Lije is the oldest Quincy to receive Yhwach's power. Now, of course, this is different to how Lije himself speaks of receiving his shrift in the manga, and so I wonder, is this meant to be taken literally? Is Lije actually the oldest Quincy to receive Yhwach's power in regards to his age, or is it just a weird way of saying he was the first, and therefore his shrift is technically the oldest of the bunch? If Lije is physically the oldest, then that's fascinating to me, because that presumably means that Yhwach was indeed giving out shrifts over 1,000 years ago, where we had originally assumed that wasn't the case. And to be honest, a big part of me still feels that it's more likely that he wasn't doing. Because, for example, wouldn't that mean that the original Schutzstaffel, of which Lije wasn't a member, also had shrifts as well, presumably? And that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. In fact, it simply makes more sense for shrifts to be a more modern invention, such as when we see Asnod receiving his shrift in the modern day. Truthfully, while we don't know a lot about the original Sternritter army, we do know that both Hashwolf and Basby were indeed members. It's heavily implied Robert was a member as well, and I think we can fairly safely assume that characters like Kirige were involved too. If Lige is the oldest character to have received a shrift and the first, then he received his over 1,000 years ago before these guys who we know to be there, or we think they were there, did as well. This would also mean that Lige is over 1,000 years old, which honestly isn't that surprising. On the flip side, if it is just a weird or different reading of Lige being the first to receive a shrift, well, that we already know. However, moving on, Kubo says that he has never once lost it, Yuharbark's power, since then. So this is interesting too. Presumably what he means by this is Lige has never been struck by the Owl's Valen in the last however many years, potentially 1,000 years or more, and thus the power he was given by Yuharbark has quite literally never degraded in any fashion. Again though, it's kind of weird, right? Because it really calls into question the timeline. Because as you'll see, it's that length of time, pretty much solely, that seems to result in Lige's weird powers. So what I'm wondering is, has there really been no other Sternritter to have had Yuharbark's power unbroken for such a lengthy period of time? What about Hashwolf and Basby, who we know for certain were both present 1,000 years ago then? If we assume they didn't get their shrift until after the First War, why would Lige have received one that much earlier than them? Certainly, Hashwolf in particular feels like a weird case to me. Even if Yuharbark was only experimenting with giving Lige a shrift initially, you wouldn't imagine it would be that much longer before he then gave one to his so-called first son. The only way I can make this timeline make sense in my head is if Lige was around during that first war, and was maybe one of a few powerful Sternritter whom Yuharbark experimented with shrifts on. Maybe he gave one to Lige, seeing potential in him and his zealous loyalty, and then also gave them to his original Schutzstaffel. But the original Schutzstaffel were all wiped out in the First War, while Lige managed to survive into the present day. And perhaps Yuharbark had planned on seeing how these shrifts worked in battle, and then dispensing shrifts to the rest of his soldiers, but his defeat at the hands of Yamamoto put a wrench in his plans, essentially. It delayed his plans significantly, and Lige was kind of left in the lurch as the only surviving soldier from that original war with a shrift, and maybe he was stuck that way for close to 900 years. And once Yuharbark awoke again after regaining his heartbeat and maybe his mind as well, so that would be 990 years prior to the main storyline, he gave shrifts to the likes of Hashwolf and Basby much, much later than Lige as he began to rebuild his army. Now that I've said it out loud, that sounds a little messy, but that seems to be the only way I can make the timeline work. That would mean Lige had his shrift for 900 more years than every other Sternritter, even the likes of Hashwolf, Basby, Robert, and Kirige, who, according to this theory, all only received theirs after Yuharbark awoke almost a millennia later. And maybe he was like, well, my original Schutzstaffel died, so that kind of sucks, but the idea of shrifts is pretty sound, so here you go. I mean, it still doesn't really make sense to me, ultimately, that Yuharbark wouldn't just immediately give Hashwolf a portion of his soul almost as soon as they met, and he kind of realised who and what he was. But, alas. It is kind of interesting, though, because the way Kubo words this part of the answer, saying, Lige has never once lost it since then. It kind of feels to me like Yuharbark dispensing, taking back his power, redistributing it again, and maybe giving it back to the Quincy he took it from, and new Quincy is a thing that happens regularly. Insofar as Shrift Bearers, or the Vortlik I guess specifically, often died during the however many years after Yuharbark awoke and before they attacked the Soul Society. So about 100 or so, and so he was cycling powers in and out between potentially loads of different versions of the Sternritter, while Lige is one of the very few to have remained totally constant throughout. That being said, the youngest generation of the Sternritter, plus Basby for some reason, didn't seem to know about Alsvalen, so that was kind of odd. And again, I'm trying to think that presumably Robert knows about Yuharbark's tendency to use Alsvalen on his own men when he deems them no longer necessary because he was there in the first battle, but Basby, Lil Toto, Giselle, etc., they should know about Alsvalen anyway because Yuharbark used it not that long ago. He used it on Masaki and Kane Katagiri. Anyway, we're kind of going off on a tangent there. After this, though, Kubo finishes by saying, and I quote, "For that reason, because the power inside of him had grown excessively, it had started to change his body into something more than human." So this is definitely the strangest and potentially wildest portion of the answer, the portion that feels the most unknown to me. We didn't really know any of this. We didn't know that the piece of Yuharbark's power within the Sternritter apparently just grows and grows, seemingly exponentially over time, and that it's so strong and so transformative that it can eventually alter their genetic makeup. Kubo confirms that Lige used to be human, completely human, but as a result of bearing Yuharbark's power within himself for apparently such a long period of time, he's now become more than human. Much more than a man on the outskirts of being a god. This feels insane to me, but it also does make some sense. Yuharbark, after all, is the son of the Soul King, even if we still don't really know what that means, but it stands to reason that if that's literally the case, he would have similar, if slightly lesser, powers. And even his very body, his essence, like Adnias, has the ability to totally transform a normal, mortal man into something else. It's a little like Ukitake, taking in just a tiny piece of Mimihagi's power, a shade of Mimihagi, and that being enough to completely save his life for hundreds of years. By taking in Yuharbark's power and leaving it unchecked essentially, Lige has mutated over time into this new holy being. That makes sense to me, I guess, but it does leave the door open to even more questions. For example, would this happen to literally every Quincy if they were left alone long enough? Does every single Sternritter have the capability to become something akin to this? An immortal, angelic being? Or is this specific to Lige because of his already inherent strength? I say that because it does kind of feel like the X-axis plays into this a lot, the fact that Lige is intangible, and then he eventually becomes a being made entirely of light that cannot be cut except by the Shinken Hakyoken. Those two kind of feel like they work together, but maybe that would be the case for whatever Shrift is allowed to grow like this. And if a Sternritter is either hit by Alsvalen or even just has their Volstendish taken away from them like Lil Toto and Giselle, is that literally it for them? Can they no longer retain these strange forms, or does the power within them just kind of reset and then need additional time to grow back again? Could they eventually regain their Volstendish and then potentially a power even beyond it? The Shrift is technically inherently the Sternritter's individual power. It is their own, but Yuharbark essentially uses pieces of his soul to call it out, seeing these words emblazoned upon each being. So that explains why certain Sternritter can continue to use their power after being hit by the Alsvalen, because it is theirs at the end of the day. The final point I want to address before we wrap this up is Uryu. He's never been struck by the Alsvalen, and with Yuharbark dead at the end of the series, and presumably now incapable of taking back any still distributed pieces of his own soul, does that mean Uryu is now set to become as eventually strange, angelic, and frankly unkillable as Lige was? Sure, it might be a long way off yet, but if this is accurate, then Yuharbark's power still permeating within Uryu's soul should continue to just grow and grow, right? Eventually, Uryu may also become something more than human. It does make me wonder what that means too. What are they becoming if not human? What has Lige become? Halfway between man and god, some kind of vessel of the Soul King in his own right. I do want to point out as well that despite all of this, despite Lige having this new power, despite his body changing and becoming more than human, he still lost his divine power just like every other Sternritter when his halo was destroyed. Again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that his halo wasn't destroyed when his head was blown up, but there you go. Alright everyone, but that's it for today's video. A bit of a shorter one this time, but I do appreciate you checking it out. I hope you enjoyed it, but you got some value away from it as well. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below about Kubo's newest answer regarding Lille Barro. It's very interesting to me. These are characters that I would always love to learn more and more about, so hopefully he keeps answering questions about the Schutzstaffel, but I guess we'll have to see. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think this makes sense? Do you think it doesn't make sense? I'd love to get your opinions, so do please let me know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you for watching. Consider hitting subscribe down below if you haven't done already. It does make a huge difference. And check out the Patreon as well, just like all of these people have. And they're all helping me out over there too, to help keep the lights on here at the channel. And again, it is greatly appreciated. So thank you all so very much. Alright everyone, until next time, I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.